We've been doing, as we looked at these meals with Jesus, we've been looking at a little bit of how we can encourage you to get involved in a conversation. And so, like last week and the week before, there will be some moments where we say, pause to discuss this. It's an opportunity for you just to stop the video, to then, if you're with people, have a conversation around some of those questions. Maybe just think through your own responses. And then, I don't know, have a conversation over lunch maybe, or meet up with a friend during the week. In a cafe, we can do that now, isn't it great? And just say, actually, what did you think? And so here is our first question. The slide is going to come up. What do you think? Oh, he says that's not the question for this week. Let me turn around, thank you. What do you most enjoy doing on a Sunday? And are there things you wish you didn't have to do on a Sunday? There you go. Take a moment to do that. There are three questions in the passage that I want to explore together. And they are this. What can I do at a shared lunch? Where do I sit? And who do I sit with? So question one, what can I do at a shared lunch? The reason, in a sense, is just quite simple. The setting is Jesus has gone to the synagogue with lots and lots of others, and the leader of the synagogue has probably said, look, let's have lunch afterwards. And so just in our minds, it's good, isn't it, to be thinking that this is all happening at a shared lunch, or the equivalent back then of what we do today. I remember really clearly we were doing a first aid course. Gareth was our trainer, and we were doing it in the school where we used to meet to worship. We had the keys, which means that we could get in the evening as long as we'd booked, and they knew we were there. And which meant that the gates were open into the car park, and the front door of the school was open because there was just us in there. And as Gareth was beginning to do some teaching, this guy walked in. And he started shouting at our first aid trainer, who was a paramedic, and we'd actually done the week before a session on how to diffuse difficult situations. And I was there thinking, oh, isn't this great? Gareth has organised something so that we can see what it's like. He's doing a role play for us. And he began to engage with the person and use all the tools. And then I just saw his eyes flicker towards me, as if to say, Dominic, what are you doing? And there's me thinking that, Gareth has arranged a role play. He's thinking, Dominic set me up again. And what is he doing to thee? And it was only as we talked about it afterwards that we realized actually that this was actually genuine. This person had just walked in off the street, and we had to deal with a real life situation. But it was funny as we talked about it afterwards, both of us assuming that the other had set it all up. And I think that that's what you see at this meal, because there's no doubt that the person that comes there and that Jesus sees has been brought there to test Jesus. It's a bit of a setup. What's he going to do? He's told us so much about his heart for the poor, about how they know he's going to heal and do everything else. And so let's bring him in, give Jesus a test. And of course, when Jesus does heal him, he goes away. So he clearly wasn't an invitee to the meal. What we see is Jesus' real concern for suffering and making a difference in people's lives, meeting the imposition of restrictions for God's people by the religious leaders. And of course, they were doing this for all the very best reasons. Exodus 20, verse 8, where we go through the Ten Commandments, it talks about the Sabbath, and therefore what you need to do or not do on the Sabbath. So they would justify that their restrictions and what you shouldn't do was there for the sake of God's people. So how was Jesus going to engage with this whole idea of what he was going to do and why it was appropriate or not? It's probably, isn't it, worth just taking a moment to think about what is the Sabbath principle and where does it come from? Of course, if you read Exodus 20, then you will know that it points us back to Genesis chapter 1. That idea that on the seventh day God rested. That doesn't mean he didn't do anything, but he rested. What does that idea of God resting look like? Because, of course, at the end of the seventh day, unlike all the other six, there is no evening and no morning. So kind of day 7 in the telling of Genesis 1 continues. So what is God doing? Well, God is walking in the garden. He is investing in his relationship with humanity. He is there with them, a very real presence. They are with God and they speak with God and they see God face to face. That's kind of an insight into that Eden perfect day of rest. But of course, Adam and Eve reject God's ways. And the consequence of that, of what was tending becomes toil, work becomes labor. You know, it's this idea of actually everything is just so hard and so difficult. And of course, they're sent from the garden. They are no longer able to be with God and walk with him and talk to him face to face as they had. So why is the Sabbath brought in Exodus as Moses shapes God's people as to how we can understand things? Well, it was basically for restoring relationship. The Sabbath, as it's instituted, was a window back into that time when you can say, well, actually, this is the day in which we will make sure that we restore our relationship with God, that we spend time with him, that actually this is about enhancing life and getting away from some of the punishments that were as a result of rejecting God's ways. That's why when Jesus queried about the Sabbath, says, remember that the Sabbath is made for humanity, not humanity for the Sabbath. It's there to give us life, to bring life. And of course, then we see that if you go into, for example, Hebrews chapter 4, which talks about the Sabbath rest for God's people and about how that they will enjoy his presence for eternity, and that is a presence which brings life and wholeness and fulfillment. You can begin to see that the Sabbath is a real gift. But of course, the way the Pharisees were applying their understanding of the Sabbath was, of course, that it was the opposite. You can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. It just emphasizes, in a sense, how humanity's distance from God is just reinforced. That actually that relationship with God is just at the end of a whole load of rules and regulations. And so Jesus says no. How does he help them see that? He talks about, look, if you had a child that was in trouble, or even an animal that was in trouble, wouldn't you rescue them? Well, he knows that they're not going to say, no, I'll let my child fall and drown in a well because it's the Sabbath day. He knows that. They're not heartless. So he's saying, look, understand the Sabbath is about rescue and about life. And of course, that's what Jesus is here for. He's come to rescue. That's what the kingdom of heaven is about, to bring us from death into life. So of course he heals. Because the Sabbath is about relationship. It's about being with God. It's about enjoying his presence. Flip your mind, I'm sure, to the story that you know really well of Mary and Martha, the one who is in the kitchen getting everything ready, the one who is the hospitable one, making sure lots and lots of people can gather. And there's the other one who just says, no, I just want to sit there with Jesus. I just want to hear every single thing that he has to say. Of course, you'd think that the one who was serving others would be the one that Jesus says, isn't that great, a good example? But he doesn't. Why? Because he's saying it's about relationship. Let's not make our busyness, even our busyness doing good things for others, take away from our need and the importance of relationship with God and spending time with Him. So that's why Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He doesn't want them to be thinking, oh, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. He's saying, no, that's not at all why God has given us the Sabbath. It's good to pause and think, isn't it? What are the things that get in the way for us? We don't live in that kind of world where everything is set down and everything is shut and you can't do anything other than go to church in the morning. But actually, there are lots and lots of other things, aren't there, that impact upon our relationship with God, our ability to enjoy Him, to build relationships with others. What are the things that get in the way? So easy, isn't it, to look at the Pharisees and see how they got it wrong and say, oh, of course, I'd never do that, without pausing to think for ourselves. Anyway, a couple of questions for you to just talk about as we go into the second question. What contribution do you make to the life of St. Paul's? What value do you place on that contribution? Take a moment, pause the video, write the questions down, either talk about it or come back to them later. Question 2, where do I sit? It's one of those really, really difficult things when you have to do a wedding in church, when you realize that actually people have come and sat fairly near the front without a thought, when you're thinking actually there's going to be bridesmaids and family and parents, and actually there are other people who need to going to come and sit in these rows because they've asked us to keep kind of 3 or 4 rows free at the front. And it's one of the really difficult things I've had to do at times is to go to people and say, I'm really sorry, you can't sit here. Can you sit further back? And of course, then, you can see them because there's this awful embarrassment. They think that they're really important, so therefore they probably do need to sit fairly near the front. But actually, other than the reserved seats, the rows at the front, then actually the next few rows are taken. And you can see them thinking, well, do I just go backwards and ask everybody else to go back and shove somebody else out of their seat? Or do I go and sit right at the back and then I feel really, really insignificant because I'm really, really important in this family? It's just interesting seeing that dynamic. I don't know whether you've ever seen it. I certainly have. And of course, remember the kingdom of heaven, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and Nathan also mentioned last week about Isaiah 25, verses 6 and 7, this picture of the banquet. And Jesus has that in mind, but he also speaks from Proverbs 25, which has this really good advice. Do not exalt yourself in the king's presence, and do not claim a place among his great men. It is better for him to say to you, come up here, than for him to humiliate you before his nobles. Jesus has that in mind as he sees them all, shuffling. Who can sit closest to the leaders? Who can sit on the table where the influencers are? Who can be with the ones who are, really, really significant in the community or whatever? And so it's just some really, really practical advice from Proverbs. But of course, like so many things, Jesus, when he puts his finger on things, doesn't just talk about whether or not we are deserving or undeserving, or how well connected we are and all the rest of it. I think he's asking the question, how do you see yourself? More than that, he's saying, what is your view of your own self-worth? And what determines it? So, of course, a wedding is an easy example because often where you sit is determined by the proximity and closeness of your relationship. But of course, when it's in a gathering in other circumstances where it's very different, then we often sit where we think that we should be, and that's based upon our assessment of ourselves, our achievements, our success. Or maybe the flip side, our lack of achievement or our lack of success in human terms. And also, we think about whether we're better or not than others, whether we deserve things more. The danger, of course, is that Jesus isn't just talking about a meal, because every time there is a meal there, he's thinking, what is this saying about the values of the kingdom of heaven? And of course, it may be completely insignificant, actually, who sits where at that table and as they reclined around it on that particular day. But what he is saying is, how do you think that God sees you? Because that's the profound issue, isn't it, around our self-worth. Because if we think that actually the things that we do or the contributions that we make or the people that we know or how long we've been in a particular place are the things that give us value and self-worth, then the danger is that we slip into thinking that this is how God sees us. If I see myself this way, God sees me in the same way. And when we begin to think that, somehow the danger is that we begin to think that, of course, I'm a Christian because God deems me worthy. That there is something about my achievements or my intellect or my service or my family that means that somehow I've passed muster, so that God says, yep, of course you're in, well done. Remember 2 weeks ago we talked a little bit, didn't we? About this, the difference between Simon the Pharisee and the woman who came to his house, and the one who thinks that they sees and the one who genuinely sees, and it was not the way that they thought it would be. Because actually, if that was about seeing others and understanding how we need to see others, today is about understanding how we see ourselves, how we position ourselves, how we understand ourselves within the kingdom of God framework. How do we learn to see ourselves as God sees us? And how do we humble ourselves before the God of grace? I'm not saying, of course, that what we achieve and what we do and the values that we have are of no importance, not at all. But it's also understanding that they might be a response to God's love, but they are not a precondition. And therefore it's important, isn't it? Because if we understand, actually, that there is nothing that we bring, there is nothing that we can achieve, there is no connection that makes us enabled to be, in a sense, part of God's family, but actually that we're undeserving, but he is a God of grace and rescue and comes to us and says, come, come, come. Then actually it's about who we pray for, who we befriend, who we invite to share our lives, share our homes, share a meal in a cafe with us. It's about actually recognizing that if we are unworthy and if we had nothing, then there is nobody, in a sense, outside of God's reach. But also recognizing that as we engage with others, then there is a graciousness, a desire to listen and understand their story. There is an investment in them because they are of immense importance and value to God, and therefore we need to reflect that. The way we treat others under God is often a reflection of how we see ourselves. And it's one of those things, isn't it, that so much of it is learnt behavior. We treat others the way we've been treated. We try and raise our children the way we were raised, or maybe it's just the opposite, depending on whether that was good or bad. But actually, so much of it's learnt. And the difficulty is that humility is such a hard thing to model, isn't it? Where do we learn to have this sense of clear identity so that who I am under God isn't at all threatened by what other people think of me? It's not bolstered by the things I might achieve or the way in which I use God's gifts to do wonderful things. Of course, humility is modeled for us by Jesus, isn't it? Philippians 2. Let me read it to you. Though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore God also highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. Here is the example of humility, who is able to stand before Pilate and the questioning of, and say, actually, of course, I'm not threatened by what you might say or do to me. I know exactly who I am. To know also that actually God raises him to the highest of heights. What might this look like? That's for you to think a little bit. But just let me give you just a couple of insights. A friend, Mark, is a very, very successful businessman. He runs his own business. He wins awards. He does very well financially out of it. Every year he takes 8 of the people who work in his organization and takes them to an orphanage that the company supports and finances in Uganda. And it's interesting, no one has to go. Nobody is, say it's held against them. So if you don't go, then that's your opportunities to progress or anything else hindered. Not at all. But he says actually that people view him differently, because when you go and you spend 5 days with others, either mixing kind of mud to make bricks, painting walls, cleaning out whatever, that people begin to see you in a different light, because actually they see that although you're really successful and everything else, there's something else to you. And he pays for them all to go, and he pays rather than the business. It's not a tax dodge. And what's interesting is that the people who have gone are some of his most loyal workers, because they understand both his drive but also his humility and his love of others and what he's willing to do for others. Really interesting example. We have a friend, Lydia, and she's a young mum. She's not working at the moment. She's just brilliant at being at the school gates on a morning and just seeing, just from that look in people's eyes, which are the mums who are really tired or at the end of their kind of what they can cope with. She's brilliant at saying, do you want me to pick your kids up after school and just give you an hour or two and I'll feed them and bring them over? Just because she values, she's on the lookout. Who are those who are struggling? Who are those who are suffering? Who are those that actually we need to do, I need to do something for, because they also need rescuing? And it may give opportunities to talk about Jesus and the faith you have. It might not at the first time. But it's thinking, isn't it? It's not just who I sit with, it's how do I spend time with those around me and value them and recognize who they are under God. We're going to pause and have our third question, but just let me introduce it, because what is great about the gospel of grace is that it's about getting what you don't deserve. So the question that's going to come up is, how do you apply the gospel of grace in a school or workplace? It's really hard. I've spent time as a school chaplain, because everything you say in the workplace or in a school is, you've got to work for what you get. If you don't work, you won't get anything. I'd love to be able to say to my kids at the moment, you know what, don't bother about doing any work, don't revise for your exams. Actually, you'll just get fantastic grades because you get what you don't deserve. It's just not like that, is it? So how do we work out what the gospel of grace looks like when we talk about it in school or work, so that it isn't something of ridicule? Give you a few minutes just to talk that one through, think that one through, stop the video and start again when you've had a chance to do that. Final question, who do I sit with? Jesus is straight to the point, isn't he? You don't have nice dinner party circles. You make sure that you've got an idea of looking for the people who are in need. And it's quite clear, isn't it, in those verses. I don't know whether you've read Charlotte's Web. You might have read it to your children or grandchildren. And Templeton is an interesting character. It probably kind of gives it away when you realize that Templeton is the rat, to realize he's not going to be a great character. But every time something is asked of him, his answer is always, what do I get out of this? How do I benefit? And he's always looking after himself. He's always thinking about what's good for him. And Jesus, when he looks at the Pharisee and says, look, when you do this again, these are who you invite. He's thinking about the motives. He's thinking about the guy's humility. He's thinking about the guy's own self-worth. And what he's saying is, look, there is a real need, isn't there? If meals are going to be a symbol, back to this Isaiah 25, if meals are going to be a symbol of the kingdom of heaven and a lived out, in a sense, gospel story, which of course is something that we know so much, don't we? When we gather at communion around the Lord's table, that this is a meal that's acting out the story of salvation. We know that. How do we begin to think about what this might look like in terms of blessing those in needs? And I think a question for you to go away and think about, and if you've picked up the home group notes, is one of the questions that we asked. Is this just about meals, or is this about evangelism? Is it about who and how we share our lives with others, not just who we have round for a meal? Because, of course, if God values and has a heart for the poor, but God is also on a rescue mission, how do we share our lives so that that is evident? So I don't think this is about who you have round for dinner. I think it's much more profound than that. And it's Jesus saying, if you get this, how is this going to influence what you do week in, week out? But of course, it's not just about having a heart for the poor and going out and feeding others and doing things like that. It's actually saying, look, there is two things here that are really important. Yes, we need to be engaging with people's needs, but we must never lose sight, as Jesus didn't when asked about what to do about healing, saying this is a rescue mission. This is about restoring relationships with God. You see, the gospel of grace is very, very countercultural. It's about actually going to places, valuing others, seeing things and doing things that you don't benefit directly from. It's not been about a Templeton. It's about understanding that Jesus wants us to live radically different lives. And so he's saying, live out your life so that it's a foretaste and a picture and teaching about the kingdom of heaven. It's a challenge, isn't it, at this particular time? I'm just thinking of my own situation. I think I don't know anybody. I haven't met anybody since we moved here that isn't a member of the church. How do I get involved in evangelism? Because you can't go anywhere or do anything or meet people. It's a question, isn't it? But I think Jesus is asking that profound question, not just who do you sit next to, but who is sharing your life with you? How are others able to see the difference that Jesus makes for you? I'm tempted to say, give it a go, have a try. But of course, every time I say try, my kids always come back with the words of Yoda. Do or do not. There is no try. But anyway, I'll leave it to you. Just that thought of how can I make sure that, like Jesus is doing here, that my life lived out is helping people see the gospel of grace and understand what that's about. There's going to be a final question that's going to come up for you on the screen. And we'll leave it up for a couple of minutes because the musicians are going to come up and there's going to be a little change here. But those two questions, what do you think you'll be doing differently this week as you reflect on Jesus' life and what that means and how he shares his life with others? And are there things the church should be doing this week that are different? A couple of questions to think over, talk over, and then we'll continue in song in a moment.